Welcome, everyone, to the final episode of our What Works series, where you get practical advice from Eckerson Group Consultants. My name is Wayne Eckerson, and I'm the moderator of this series. And here are the consultants who have regaled you with all kinds of practical advice and tips and tricks for how to do data analytics in an optimal way. Really honored today to have Carlos Bossy with us. He's been our longtime data architect, data engineer, and he's going to talk about one of his favorite topics, data zones for all consumers. Basically, how do you architect a data lakehouse, data warehouse for success? So just a little bit about Eckerson Group, in case you don't know us. We are a consultancy that specializes in data and analytics. Our key differentiator is that we're all white-haired or no-haired guys who've got lots of experience in this field, 25 years of practitioner or consulting experience, at least 25. I think, Carlos, you and I have probably 30 or more each. And unlike some, we pride ourselves in creating actionable data strategies for clients so that they get a blueprint for how to take the next steps in their journey for the next usually 3 years to move the needle in what they can do with data and analytics. We also create custom solutions for clients because we listen real deeply and synthesize well what we hear and create something that's unique to an organization's culture and requirements. And because we put out a lot of research and content, we have discovered over the years that we actually have trained a whole cadre of consultants in our field in the basics and success factors for data analytics. This is our team. These are the areas which we consult. And if you would like more information about how we could help you, please contact me or Julie after the call, after the webinar. And some of our clients, big and small, brand name and not, US and non-US. So also, we'd like to offer you a free 30-minute call with Carlos. So the first three who mention that in the chat will get that 30-minute call, and Julie will help arrange that for you. So I think that, I'd like to introduce Carlos. Helped Microsoft build its data warehouse for Office 365. And he's been referred by the Kimball Group for complex data warehousing projects. He's a guy who really knows what he's doing, and he's been around and seen a lot and done a lot. Carlos has done a lot of work in this space, and we're very proud to have you here with us today to talk about, I know, one of your favorite topics, which is how to architect data zones in your data lakehouse or data warehouse. So, Carlos, without further ado, I'll let you take over.
Thanks a lot, Wayne, and I'm happy to be here talking about this. It's a topic we can discuss for quite some time. We've been following this approach for several years now, and what I like about this approach is that it seems to be a good fit for almost any type of organization. You could be a public or private, government, non-government, manufacturing, retail, medical, anything. Almost anybody could benefit by this type of approach. So, we talk about building a data lakehouse, and so this really is a discussion of what makes up the data lakehouse and how do you organize it, how do you structure it. And so I think one of the things we found over the years, and I'll make this point over and over again, is we want data to be accessible to people, how they need it, when they need it, and the way they need it. And so by dividing it up or putting it into different zones with each with a very much a purpose to the zone, we get that kind of result for a lot of people out there in business, whether they're analysts, advanced analysts, regular users, or simply point and click users. It provides what everybody needs. So I'm going to talk about 7 zones here, and one of the things I do want to say is that there's a note over on the right, guiding principles. These zones are not cast in stone. They might vary based on your needs, and they might be different. You might talk about this concept and come up with a zone that we don't talk about here, and that's all valid. I think people just need to make sure they're supporting their customer base and who's consuming the data. And the approach we take is that we want things to be consumption driven. And so the zones support how people are consuming the data. And so In many organizations, we have different types of users, different types of consumers. And one of the things in the past, when storage was much more expensive or it was much harder to do this, compute costs a lot more money, we tried to find kind of a one-size-fits-all solution for people. A particular data warehouse methodology, and let's put everything in that data warehouse, and that will be what the standard for the organization for analytics. And I think those approaches were good at the time. 25 years ago, it was valid to say, let's build a Kimball methodology data warehouse, and that'll be our standard. Today, we can do much more. There's a lot more capabilities we have of moving and storing data and processing it, and not as expensive as it used to be. So as I go through this, the key point is that we're now trying to store data and process it and engineer it in a way that makes it very easy for you to use no matter who you are. So the main zone, or the first zone I'll talk about, is the raw zone. And the raw zone is essentially the zone that has everything that has all the data that we can ingest and that we're interested in with no modification. The raw zone is organized in certain ways, and we'll talk about that a little more. But it's really the data lake part of the data lake house. It's a place where we can go and use all the raw data. The refined zone is usually upstream of the raw zone, and it's a place where we've already cleansed and merged and transformed data. And each of these zones I'll go through in more detail. But essentially, this is where we want things like master data and data that we create as a first level usage for the rest of the organization. The integration zone is a place where we can distribute data, often to applications or any other place that may need it in real time or in any other way. So you have a mobile app that may need a measure or metric produced from your data lakehouse. I could use the integration zone to distribute it. The analytics zone is a lot more like our traditional data marts, dimensionally modeled facts and dimensions that are still heavily used for dashboarding and other tools like that. I'll also talk about the trusted zone data that's been governed and approved, the sandboxes, analytic sandboxes, where you can do anything you want. That's a place, a playground for you. And the formatted zone, which has data that's formatted in particular ways, so it can be delivered to outside groups or anybody else. When we look at all these zones, I would say in our experience, almost every organization should at least have 3 of these zones: raw, refined, and analytic. There's almost no use case that we've seen that doesn't have those 3. And one of the things to keep in mind as we go through this is architectural oversight is important. The zones have a purpose, and making sure they comply with that purpose is important, because as soon as these zones start to get used in different ways, they start to break down. So what we'll do is we'll go through we'll show a diagram, and Wayne, maybe you can move to the next slide.
Yeah, before we do that, let's stop and take questions from the audience.
Okay.
But I'll kick it off. And for our audience members, if you do have a question or a comment, please use the Q&A tab and we'll insert you into the conversation. So I have to assume, and I think I know, there is no standard nomenclature for these zones, right? So people have many different names for the same things. Is that true? Like in Microsoft world, isn't it like the medallion architecture, like gold, silver, and bronze?
Yeah, Databricks pushed that a lot, gold, silver, bronze. I would say bronze is like the raw zone. Silver is a lot like the refined zone, I would say. And maybe some of these other zones would be in there as well. So it's a little bit broader in that sense. But generally speaking, yeah, this is a little bit more detailed than just the gold, silver, bronze designation, I think.
Now, Carlos, you and I are working with a client right now that's got PII data and lots of external regulations controlling that usage and display. Where does PII data go in here?
Well, PII data is always in the raw zone because the raw zone is unchanged. And in an organization like that would have very few people, if anybody, be able to access that or only be able to access it with approvals by various, with a certain process in place. But refined zone would also have PII in that case because the refined zone, has to cleanse and create master data. The refined zone, for example, could have a client master table or or a member master table, an address master. And that would, by nature, just contain PII. The integration zone probably in this case would not. The analytic zone would not. PII would be removed from there. And maybe the formatted zone would contain PII data because PII data has to be delivered to outside agencies often and formatted in certain ways.
So question from Chuck, what's the difference between trusted and refined zone? I'm sure we'll get into that, but at this high level, what would you say?
Yeah, the refined zone is the best thing to say about the refined zone is is to say it has master data that we've decided within an organization that we want to use as a baseline when it can be complicated to determine what that baseline is. And again, I would say client master, product master could be that kind of thing, address master. The trusted zone is anything that's been approved by, say, a governance committee, often to be used by consumers and in certain ways. So often a client master may be created by an engineering team because they need it. They have to have it just to do their work. But the trusted zone would say that that client master is also approved for usage by consumers, let's say, so that consumers can query it and produce their own data by other consumers other than engineering consumers.
Okay.
Mostly the trusted zone, I'll talk about a little bit more later. It's mostly labels. And it's correct in saying that most of what's in a refined zone would likely also be trusted, but not always the case. The refined zone can have data that just helps the process further downstream create better data.
Yeah. So now you've got these listed in a certain order. Does this represent a flow?
Not really. No, I would say things might go from the raw to the refined zone often in the first step, but at that point, the refined zone can feed the analytic zone, the integration zone, and any of the other zones. The sandbox could have data from the raw or refined zone or the analytic zone, right? So it's not really a left to right, top or a top to bottom flow. Yeah. We'll show it in a diagram, I think, a little bit too.
Yeah. And most companies start out with 3 zones, as you say, right? And then, well, I guess or the use case.
Or at a minimum, most companies will have the requirement for at least 3, but they could start out with more. In fact, I would recommend most companies also start off with sandboxes. Almost not every company has a need initially for an integration zone or a formatted zone, and they don't have a process to put a trusted zone in place.
Yeah. So we'll have to talk about the difference between the analytics sandbox and the analytics zone. But let's go to the diagram. So this is something that Carlos and I put together for a client, and this was a pretty robust data lakehouse implementation, or at least planned. So you want to step through this a little bit, Carlos, because I see you have master data on the outside there.
Right.
But that works its way, I suppose, into the refined zone too. So
yeah, so here we have a typical situation where we're ingesting a lot of data left to right, data coming from all sorts of databases and external, internal reference data, that sort of thing, and different ingestion processes, which we don't need to go into for this session's purposes. But we show data going into the raw zone, right? At least that's the idea. And I know the arrows kind of make it seem like they're going right to the refined zone, but I think everything in this case was supposed to land in the landing zone, which is the raw zone. And from the raw zone, there would be ETL, and we had MDM here, not necessarily master data, but master reference data. I guess I'm kind of differentiating here between master reference data than master data that we generate. So if we're generating a client master table, we're generating that data from a lot of the different sources and with different business rules, determining what is the master client data and landing or storing that in the refined zone. But we're using master data reference data and business rules to create that.
From the outside. So the master and reference data you see in the data sources box is what you just mentioned. It's the external reference data or external in the organization. And
It is, that's correct.
then you're using the lakehouse here to actually create and master certain other types of entities, right?
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct. So in the end, that becomes the source for client data in the refined zone is the client master, as opposed to trying to figure it out from, 20 different sources and that sort of thing. So we're essentially creating the master data in the refined zone in this case. Then we also apply MDM and other things, ETL, to create data in the other zones. We have the analytic zone here labeled as data marts, right? But that's really the same thing. Essentially, these data marts would be modeled, aggregated, or simplified. When we mean simplified, turned into things like facts and dimensions that can be easily queried by SQL or by other tools that are understood by a general population. But a lot of the complexity has been taken out of querying that data. We also have data going to the trusted zone. And like I said, the trusted zone may or may not be a movement of data. It could just be a labeling of data. Data has been reviewed, it's been approved, and it's been published. Again, to differentiate that between what's in the refined zone I may need address master data just because it makes my engineering job easier, and I don't necessarily need it to be approved by outside governing agencies, although a lot of times those two things maybe should go hand in hand. And then the sandbox zone is a place where I can do exploration, discovery, analysis. And then the integration zone is, if you look at what the integration zone is, it's really to deliver data to in an integrated, operational, near real-time sort of way. So that's an example of how data flows, and you see that the data doesn't exactly flow left to right. Data can flow from the raw zone to the trusted zone. It can flow from the refined zone to be trusted and to the data marts and to the sandbox. Raw zone can go to the sandbox. So it can vary just based on your requirements.
So what is the biggest challenge that architects and companies face in making this architecture work? What's the biggest pitfall?
Well, part of it is probably, I would say two things. One is they don't have much of a governance structure to begin with. And at some point, there probably needs to be governance in play to determine who can see what, who can use what, right? Who can actually access data directly in the raw zone, and how should it be accessed? Who can access data directly in the refined zone, and how? And I think without those governance structures, it goes underutilized, I would say. The raw zone often, like we said before, might have PII and might have other information that's not accessible to everybody, but with a good governance structure, the raw zone can be utilized other than by engineers. In this case, we show it being used by engineers, but there's value in it otherwise. It's complex, but anybody who can unravel that complexity and get value out of it should be able to use it. I would say the second thing that's really hard is the architectural oversight. Once we create these, we want to make sure they're used properly and they're updated properly. That if there truly is a change or an addition to the client master table, that it's done with the right oversight. That it's not just created as a separate entity, as a separate table. It's created in the wrong place. It starts to break things down if that happens. So the oversight is really important as well.
Well, what happens if they start lacking discipline and put the wrong data in the wrong zones? What's the upshot of that? Does it just create a lot of overhead and extra work to sort things out?
Yeah, overhead, extra work, more inconsistent results. All the problems that we see when there is no oversight otherwise. Confusion about where to find the data, where to get the data. How to use it. That's where you start to see people create in some organizations that don't have structures like this. A new table for every new report they create, or a new and they end up with a system that's unusable, really. So that's typically the problem.
Yeah, we talk a lot about governance, and we help a lot of organizations to implement governance programs, but we don't often see them governing architecture. In fact, a lot of them don't even have a senior architect, which would
Right.
be critical for overseeing this architecture and making sure it stays pure and not get diluted, as you say.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a big proponent in not putting a lot of oversight processes in place that makes it so difficult to do you can't do it. But I also understand that there's a lot of engineers out there or analysts who just need to get today's job done, and so often what they do is what they need to do to get that job done, and that sometimes misuses the architecture or doesn't adhere to the principles, and in the long run, that again always breaks down.
Yeah. So, okay, so we'll come back to this when we talk about the analytics zone and the sandbox zone, because I think those are pretty important for helping keep the purity of the warehouse, because you're giving most of the people, this outlet that they need. So,
Right.
why don't
Right.
we step through each of these zones? So, start with the all important raw zone. Oh, one more question I had. I'm sorry. I have to go back. This kind of assumes that everything's running in a data lakehouse, which kind of implies that everything's running on one platform. Now, I would suspect that would be the ideal environment, but is it possible to run different zones on different systems or different platforms running on different systems? Would you advise that or not?
It is possible, and we work with clients that do have this running on multiple systems.
It's the
You
old
know,
data lake and data warehouse architecture requires you to have that, right? So you have
yeah.
your raw zone in the data lake and your analytic and refined zone in the warehouse
I
part.
mean, there are platforms that can be everything, right? Like, the Databricks, for example, can be the data lake and the data warehouse, and it can serve other purposes. Well, for example, just to call out specific products, right? We do see sometimes this architecture across a Databricks and Snowflake architecture. We have a few clients like that the data marts are in Snowflake and everything else is in Databricks, and then in some organizations, for example, there may be storage like S3 that's used as part of this architecture as well. So it's not necessary to have it all be one architecture. I mean, I think if you have nothing and you were starting out today, it's preferable to try to keep it in a single place, but it's not necessary either. And there's good reasons often to not have it all in one place.
All right, cool. All right, so let's go to the raw zone here.
So the raw zone is the data lake part of the data lake house. It's all the data captured. Anything you capture should be stored in the raw zone. It's the place you would store it initially after ingestion. So often we call it the landing zone. No modification. It's organized. That doesn't, just because you don't modify it doesn't mean you don't organize it, because I want to organize it so I know how to use it when I need to use it. Typically, I want to organize it by data source, maybe by subject matter within the data source, and by date when I capture it. The only modifications I've seen done to a raw zone is not necessarily modifications, but often we keep versions of the data in a raw zone. So the same row of data may exist multiple times because there's different versions of that row of data or that table or that file. So you could see the same data over and over, but new versions of it. But essentially what we try to do in the raw zone is never modify it in any way. Always keep true to the source. And then when we use it, to make it usable, if you have a data catalog, tagging data in the raw zone and populating your data catalog with it is a useful thing to do. A lot of people won't use the raw zone because it's complex. Now we have data in the raw zone in some cases where we're pulling data from over 20 different databases. And the average business users, they want that complex. That's what they want engineering and architecture for. They want them to remove that level of complexity. But advanced analysts can perform ad hoc analysis in the raw zone. So often the real users of the raw zone are advanced analysts and engineers and architects. And the raw zone is the data source for further population upstream. So because I have everything in the raw zone, then I can always populate the rest of my zones using data from the raw zone. And I should ideally never delete anything from the raw zone.
Right, because We have a client right now where we were talking about the raw zone, and I don't think people there even knew that you had collected all the data from the inception of the organization to
That's
the
right.
present, right?
That's right.
All the data was in there. And I think you had even said that you could replicate that data and remove all the PII data in case, to make it easier for people who wanted that raw data, but
That's
didn't
right.
have permission to access PII.
That's right. And the beauty of that is that anything that we need to create today in a situation like that can be created. So if there's something new that needed to be done and it needed to have all the historical data, well, all the historical data is there, and from day one, and not only that, versions of all the historical data are there as well. So the prior versions of tables or rows are maintained. So that's the nice thing about the technology today is we can store everything, and so we do.
So this is why it's called the raw zone now, not a landing zone, because the landing zone implies that it lands and disappears after it's been staged.
Yeah, yeah. Often the landing zone was really more for staging purposes. That every day you might clear out the staging because you're going to stage other data. But in this case, it is an ongoing data source, right? That's maintained for hopefully forever.
Do you ever see organizations link up, wire up operational applications to the raw zone and just pull data via an API
I've
instead of
never, I don't think I've ever seen that or had a need for that, but I think that would be a valid use case for somebody wanting to get a row of data or some transactional set of data, but they don't want to hit the operational system.
Right.
You could always hit the raw zone to do that. And it would be valid, just that use case just almost never presents itself, or there's other ways to solve it.
Got it. All right. You ready to go on?
I'm ready.
Okay. Refined zone.
So the refined zone, like I said there, it's data that's been cleansed, merged, and transformed. So at this point, we're heavily processing the data. I would like to say that the refined zone can store a lot of different types of data, but the main thing that hits home with people when I talk about it is that we're storing baseline master data sets used for reporting or for further refinement. So again, the best way to talk about this is through examples. Almost every client we work with has a need for something we would call like a client or customer master table. That would be a great example of something in a refined zone. But you also might have data coming from multiple systems. You might have product data that's coming from multiple systems, and so a product master could be valid. Companies that sell health insurance and they're selling plan data across multiple systems could have a health plan master, or things like that. So there's a lot of different ways to use this data. The other thing we see again, I talk about the data being governed here and trusted. I would like to say that everybody governs the data in the refined zone, and the reason it's there is because governance has approved it, but that's really not always the case. Often the data in the refined zone is driven by architects and engineers, and analysts putting it together and driving something that's needed by themselves for consumption. But generally speaking, the refined zone can be any data that we use as baseline data. I think that's almost the best way to say it. That's baseline data for further reporting or consumption. So how do we use the refined zone besides master data? The other thing I often say is often data we have for compliance purposes is stored in the refined zone. So we have reports that need to be delivered or data sets that need to be delivered to certain agencies, outside agencies. They're there because of audit purposes. They're approved and agreed on for different reasons for shareholders. That type of data would also be refined data. And often I want to use that data as my baseline data for other purposes as well. I always like to say, if I told the IRS this is the actual data that we're reporting, well, I better use that for everybody else too,
So the refined zone really is where you put the building blocks for
That's right.
your applications, right?
That's right.
Now, and also just to clarify, when you're moving data from the raw zone to the refined zone or any other zone, you're using the ETL or ELT tools to move and transform that data and put it into these zones?
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. I mean, ETL processes or tools would be, we talk about in the first bullet point, the cleansing, merging, and transforming of data, and that would all be done through some kind of ETL process.
Okay. All right. And I guess I asked that you're using tools generally, not like writing scripts. I guess you could do either.
You could do either. There's a lot of what we would call ETL today being written as, say Python scripts. That's become somewhat of a popular, or even the SQL scripts, that are not necessarily, sometimes we think of legacy ETL tools as, drag and drop components that merge and transform data, but there's a good reason, and a lot of people out there doing it as either SQL scripts or maybe using a tool like Python or a language like Python to do it.
Well, which approach do you prefer? The ETL tool or the scripting?
I think in general for organizations that, at the enterprise level, probably the ETL tools provide more of the full solution. It ends up being probably easier and a better way to manage things with ETL tools. The ETL tools can generate a lot of the SQL for you that you need, especially the cloud-based ETL tools. I'm not sure I would go with any legacy ETL tools at this point, but any of the tools built for the cloud can do a lot of work for you that have huge advantages as opposed to hand coding everything. But there's kind of the pros and cons of each one.
Right, almost a religious thing.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to the analytics zone, my favorite zone.
Yeah. So the analytics zone, I would say to most people, is really what we would have typically called our data warehouse at some point. If you implemented a Kimball methodology, star schema based data warehouse, dimensionally modeled, the analytics zone contains that. So in this case now, the data warehouse becomes a subset of the whole solution of what we're doing. But there's still a strong need out there for data marts that are dimensionally modeled. They allow people to put measures or metrics on dashboards, kind of point and click, drag and drop. These are typically at the enterprise scale, and they're repeatable. There's business rules attached to them. There's certain ways we create them. They're approved by people like the CFOs and CEOs and things like that. So that's what we put in the analytics zone. How do we use it? We use it primarily I would say these days for dashboarding tools. But everything in the analytics zone typically should be well governed, well defined. I should be using it for trends that show measures and metrics. Mostly it's used by business users who require some kind of structured analysis. They might be reporting data in their own department. They might be department focused or subject area focused, and they need a solution that they can build in the measures and metrics and have the data produced easily. The thing is, they're typically going to be using tools that understand a dimensional model well, a star schema well, and the tools will actually then give them a lot of out-of-the-box functionality.
Yeah, so are you always dimensionally modeling these data sets, or are you just creating the wide flat table that a lot of these Tableau-like tools want?
Yeah, that's, again, that's a little bit like the religious argument about ETL. Again, the advantage to creating the dimensional models is that it makes it a little bit easier to use the concept of conforming dimensions. So dimensions can span across multiple facts, and I can have an enterprise view of the data a little bit easier. The flat wide tables are essentially the facts and dimensions flattened, and they work, right? The tools, all the tools support it that way these days too, and especially with data warehouses that are columnar in nature, they support fast querying of that type of data. So that's a valid concept too. I think in my mind, the only thing you lose by having flat tables versus dimensionally modeled tables is it's not easy to join data from two wide flat tables where I have some dimensions in common. That makes the workload quite a bit larger on the consumption engine, and it makes it a little bit more complicated to get the right solution. If I'm staying within my wide flat table, I'm usually pretty good. I mean, it'll be fairly easy to get the right result. But the star schema still holds a lot of value if it's done properly.
Do you find that the access to the analytic zone is always through a dashboard, or can people query it directly?
No, querying it directly is still a valid way to do it. It's still a good way to do some kind of discovery and analysis if you want to write SQL against it directly. It's a way that people that aren't the savviest SQL developers but have some skills can still get a lot of value out of it without having to deal with the complexity of the source systems, for example, that might have been removed. There should have been a lot of that complexity by this time would have been removed from the process.
So what happens when a data analyst hits the boundaries of the analytic zone? I mean, this happens all the time, right? If you have a legitimate data analyst, and even not, who's using SQL or even just a tool, and they get to a certain point and boom, boom, they're hitting the boundary of the dimensional model, right? Then what happens? Do you give them access to another zone?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't talked about the sandbox zone. The first place I might send them is start using your sandbox in that situation. The refine zone is valid for an analyst to use, right? It's a good place for them to go. A lot of times it might not be necessarily intended for them in some ways, but again, a good analyst can make good use of the refine zone, and there's no reason an analyst can't use a refine zone unless there's other roadblocks in place like PII or PHI. But the refine zone and a strong analyst certainly go together as well.
Okay, fair enough. Oh, sandbox zone, yeah. I have a lot of questions on this one too. So
yeah. Yeah, so the sandbox zone is a playground, right? It's a place where it's allocated to you as a user, as an analyst. It's a place where you're able, through some governed sort of way, to just, or through some access you have, you're able to copy any data you want into the sandbox zone. You could copy it from the raw zone, the refined zone, the sandbox zone. Again, depending on what you have access to and what you're allowed to do, you can put data in your sandbox. And now you have a place where you can not only query it and go crazy, doing whatever you want to do, but you can create new data sets. You can create new tables and new output. And so you can understand what you have, what you're doing. Any new insights you may have may come from the sandbox zone. But it's never used for production workloads. It's a place where once you discover something and it's useful to the rest of the organization and needs to be automated and repeated, there would be a process to promote it via governance to the rest of the system. Whether it's promoting it and turning some of that data into refined data, including it somewhere in the analytic zone, or including it somewhere else in the integration zone or otherwise.
So is this designed for individuals or departments?
Generally, I would say it's designed for individuals. An individual would have their own sandbox and be able to work in their own sandbox.
Isn't it appropriate to give departments the same kind of thing, though? So that they can create their own departmental reports using their own data that maybe they even upload from Excel or whatever.
Yeah. In fact, I would say a lot of times departments have this. They just haven't created it in a well-defined sort of way. It just happened. The departments have a place where they do their own work and are able to have processes like this and share data among themselves. So again, because these zones aren't cast in stone, that's also, you could create a sandbox zone that the department owns and uses, and everybody shares data in that sandbox and or shares what's being done in that sandbox. I could also have one that's split off just for my own use. I could also have one that's shared across a couple of departments because we're doing some work together and we want to do some exploration.
Interesting, yeah. Traditionally the sandbox zone for individuals always had a time limit on it. So your access would expire after like 90 days and all the data would disappear. Do you see that still, or
yeah, I think We often, I'd say, recommend that there's a time limit on it because, any work that's being done there it shouldn't live forever and ever. It shouldn't become something that is relied on for producing, kind of in an ungoverned sort of way. An analyst could produce some ungoverned reports out of there. And so you do want it to go away at some point. You want them to have the urgency to turn that into a production process, a process that's shared with the organization and used within the standards of the organization. So I would say it's a good concept to have, or a good idea to have, is that as sandboxes get created, there's a way to put a time limit on how it's being used and that things expire in that sandbox.
So interesting. If we go back to the departmental use of a sandbox zone, let's call it a domain zone, right? We're going to create our own zone here on the fly.
That's the better thing to say today, right? Is a domain zone.
Yeah, I would think that domain would have its own sandbox zone in the domain for people to play around and then promote stuff from their own sandbox zone into the domain zone. That would be for more standard reporting. Is that something you've seen?
I got to say, I haven't seen it played out like that specifically, but again, the zones can be used however organizations work, right? So yes, I would say I haven't seen it used that way.
I think one of our clients is using it that way.
Yeah, I think generally speaking, the fear with sandboxes is that things never go away, and once something gets put in there, it always survives, and I think that's just the reason for making things go away at some point, having that concept of it being used only for short periods of time, and then having a process that promotes data up to the domain zone is an interesting way to use it, and then promoting it there, that way now you have visibility from other people within that domain. I think those are all good concepts. I just think they're difficult to manage. And what we're trying to do is make this easy to manage.
Right.
One of the things we don't want to do is we don't want to go in there and have to clean up data after a couple of years of work because there's so much data in there that's not used anymore. So again, trying to manage it in a way that maintains the spirit of what the purpose is.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's keep moving on.
Okay. Well, we'll go through these quickly. These are like the integration zone isn't often used, but it's a way to deliver data to other places, especially to applications. Think of a concept where I have a mobile app that needs to know a particular measure that's coming from the data lakehouse, and that measure is being maybe calculated every day, or it's calculated in pseudo real time, or on a hourly basis, and that measure determines what somebody sees in a mobile application. How do they get that from the data lakehouse? Well, the idea here is that you have a zone that's able to deliver data out to those applications that is generated from inside the data lakehouse. A machine learning model could also be doing this as well, producing data in the data lakehouse that needs to be delivered out to a mobile application, for example. Now, the idea here being is that often mobile application or data lakehouses are not good at delivering single rows of data or single values. So the integration zone is a place that's set up just to do that, right? A way it can do it fast, easy, quick, and put that data out for use however it needs to be used. I would say typically there's a lot of people want this, but there's not a lot of use cases where we actually have put this in place before, but definitely a concept. This is kind of the full circle view of data, right? Where it now has come in through the data lakehouse, been crunched to a certain point where it's useful again out back to the applications or to the mobile apps.
So this is not streaming data, but it's pretty low latency. What kind of latency can you deliver
Well, that's the difficult part of this, because sometimes as a metric is created in the data lakehouse, a lot of times they might only be created once a day, right? It might be, I would say typically here though, the latency is minutes at least. Real time is usually not likely or not, I don't know if it's not needed, but it's usually not realistic often in cases like this. But there's value in doing it often frequently, right? If a measure is getting updated every hour, yet, getting access to that measure could be important in that time frame.
All right, let's move on.
So the trusted zone, again, the question earlier about what is a trusted zone? Is it physical? I'm not sure it's physical, right? In most cases, it's not like we're moving data to the trusted zone. It could be, right? It could be, and that could be a way to manage things. But like I say up at the top there, it's more of a label often than a physical zone, but it can be physical in practice. But again, this is really dependent on governance and approvals and organizational tags that, we've agreed that the client master table is the place we'll all get client data. And we've agreed on how that data is being cleansed, merged, and transformed into the client master. And so that's really what the trusted zone is about, to label the client master as trusted. Now, and again, a lot of it is because we always know we need to go to the client master, but at some point we may have two versions of it, the one that's trusted and then the one that's not trusted. But we're doing something, we need it for some other reason. And then the governance group maybe needs to promote that one to be trusted, so it could be because we have multiple versions of the same thing. And it could be who's asking for it and what we're using for compliance purposes. Often the trusted data has to be the one that we've delivered for compliance or some other type of purpose like that as well.
So is it safe to say that could be a virtual zone where you're using tags to tag data in other zones to create
Yeah,
it?
you could say it that way, right? It could all be virtual.
Cool. Okay. Oh, it's the last one here, I think, right?
Yeah, and I'll go through this one quickly again because this is a simple. Think of data that you have in your facts and dimensions, and at some point that data needs to be delivered to an outside agency or a partner, a business partner, or some government agency, and so the source of that is the analytics zone, but the format it has to go out in is JSON. So we take a fact, join it to a few dimensions, and then create a JSON file out of it. And so the formatted zone has that data. It's the same as what was in another place in our architecture. It's either something we got from the analytics zone, something we got from the refined zone, but it's been formatted in a certain way because again, it's going to be consumed in that way by other places. And this can also be used for data sharing, data marketplaces. Often data is shared as CSV or as JSON, but it's about creating data that's somewhere else and formatting it in a different way than storing it in that format as well.
Okay, so I think that was it. This is the summary slide. We went through these 7 zones. Carlos, last words.
I guess the last thing I would say here is, at the bottom right, I talk about architectural oversight, keeping the zones in line with their purpose. Really important. We even talked about something like the sandbox zone. It can get out of control and be a problem, start to be a problem if it's not clean, if things aren't kept clean and modeled and used in the way they're intended to be used. Keep that in mind as you do this. I don't think architectural oversight needs to be a heavy duty process. It can be just like a quick review, just like sending something for review and it gets approved, and yeah, that's the right place to do it. The approval says that's the right place to do it. It's you're adding something to the client master table and we agree. But it's something that needs to be done because just like anything else, these things break down over time. If the intent of the analytics zone is to model things as a star schema, we want to make sure everything in there is part of that star schema. And we don't want to get into a place where, like I've seen a lot of clients that we work with, where you go in and look at their architecture and their system and they have 16,000 tables because they're basically ungoverned and there is no oversight. So they just create a new table for every need that they have. And I want to avoid that in all these cases because these things don't work unless we stick to the spirit of the purpose.
So if your organization has not been rigorous or disciplined in maintaining its architecture and creates that jungle with a lot of overgrowth, what do you recommend that they do if they understand what they need to do, but they've got this jungle they're dealing with?
Right.
How do they get from A to B?
Yeah, so typically what we suggest is start small, right? Take a use case, the next use case you're going to work on. And the use case will probably be limited. It probably won't include all of these zones or all the big architecture, but build out what that use case needs. So that use case, let's say, just needs a raw zone and refined zone. And maybe you end up building a use case that has 20 tables in the raw zone and 3 in the refined zone, and start to build it that way. So as you build new things, you start to build them with this approach in mind. And like you said, discipline and rigor, right? Those are the important things. So build that first use case, then build the second use case on top of that, build the third use case on top of that. Don't try to boil the ocean and try to determine how all these zones might be developed at the start. Build what you need and then start to build that out over time.
Great. Well, with that, Carlos, thank you so much for your time and insights today. And I'd also like to thank our audience for participating and listening. We hope you found a lot of value in this. If you would like to talk to us more, please send us a note at info@eckerson.com or wayne@eckerson.com, and we will respond. And if you would like to set up a call with Carlos, let us know. So thank you and have a great day and a great weekend.
Thank you very much.